They came for her at noon, when the sun could witness everything. In the heart of Creston Falls, Wyoming Territory, 1874, a woman's screams tore through the marketplace as 4 pairs of hands held her down. Scissors flashed, dark hair fell like rain onto dust, soot blackened her cheeks while the crowd stood frozen, watching a widow be unmade for the crime of surviving. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Until a man's shadow fell across the scene, and a voice cut through the silence like iron through stone. "She's coming with me." What happened next would mark them both forever. Before we begin this story of courage and redemption, I invite you to stay until the very end to see how one moment of defiance changes 2 broken lives. Please hit that like button and comment your city below so I can see how far Elena and Jacob's story travels across the world. The September heat lay thick over Creston Falls like a wool blanket nobody could shake off. Dust hung in the air, turned golden by afternoon sun that showed no mercy. The main street baked under it. Wooden storefronts, hitching posts, water troughs that hadn't been full since July. Even the horses stood still, too hot to swish their tails at flies. Jacob Hale had come to town for supplies. Nothing more. 50 pounds of flour, 20 of sugar, coffee, salt, lamp oil. The kind of list that kept a man alive through winter on a remote ranch where the nearest neighbor was 8 miles off and preferred it that way. He tied his horse outside Garrett's Mercantile and stepped into the shade of the awning, letting his eyes adjust from the glare. That's when he heard the scream. Not a startled yelp or a child's cry. This was the sound of something breaking, raw, desperate, the kind of scream that came from a throat that had already screamed itself hoarse and found one more. It cut through the drowsy afternoon like a knife through cloth, and every person on that street went still. Jacob's hand moved to his hip out of instinct, finding empty air where his sidearm used to hang before he'd given up that life. His jaw tightened. Another scream, shorter this time, choked off mid-breath, coming from the alley between the bank and the grain warehouse. He moved. His boots hit the boardwalk hard, then the packed dirt of the street. Around him, people had stopped what they were doing. A woman with a basket of eggs. 2 men outside the saloon, the barber in his doorway, razor still in hand, all of them looking toward the alley. All of them standing absolutely still. Jacob pushed past them. "Move!" The crowd had formed a loose half-circle around the alley mouth, close enough to see but far enough to claim they weren't really involved. Cowards, all of them. Jacob shoved through, ignoring the muttered complaints, and stopped cold at what he saw. 4 people, 3 holding, 1 held. The woman on her knees was young, maybe 25, maybe less. Dark hair, or it had been. Now it hung in jagged chunks around her face, hacked short and uneven. Loose strands stuck to her cheeks where someone had smeared them with something black. Soot, maybe. Ash. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, buttons missing. Her hands were bound in front of her with rough rope that had already rubbed her wrists raw. 2 women held her arms. An older man with a thick gray beard held her by the hair, what was left of it. And a younger man, thin and sharp-faced, stood in front of her with a pair of scissors in one hand and a look of righteous fury that made Jacob's stomach turn. "Disgrace to his memory!" the young man was shouting, spit flying from his lips. "You think you can walk away from what you owe? You think his name dies with him while you go on living?" The woman on her knees said nothing. Her eyes were open but unfocused, looking at something beyond the alley, beyond the town, maybe beyond this world entirely. Shock, Jacob recognized. He'd seen it on battlefields, on men who'd watched their friends die. The mind's way of leaving when the body couldn't. The young man grabbed her chin, forcing her face up. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you, Elena." Jacob's voice came out quiet, deadly quiet. "Let her go." 5 heads turned. The young man's face twisted into a sneer. "This doesn't concern you, stranger. I'm making it concern me." Jacob took 3 steps forward, closing the distance. Up close, he could see the details. The woman's face wasn't just smeared with soot, they'd marked her. Deliberate lines across her forehead, her cheeks. Her lips were split and bleeding. One eye was swelling shut, and her hands, tied in her lap, were shaking so badly the rope burned against her skin with every tremor. The older man spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. "This is family business. The girl's a widow. She owes a debt to her late husband's kin, and she tried to run. We're teaching her the price of betrayal. By cutting her hair and beating her in public? By marking her for what she is, the young man spat, a woman who let my brother die and then dishonored his memory. She has no right to hold her head up in this town, no right to his property, his money, or his name. Jacob looked at the woman, Elena, and saw her flinch at the words, saw the way her whole body tried to curl in on itself, to become smaller, to disappear. He'd seen that before too. Animals in traps, prey that knew the predator had won. "How'd he die?" Jacob asked. The question caught them off guard. The young man blinked. "What?" "Your brother. How'd he die?" "Fever. 3 months back." The man's voice cracked slightly. "She should have saved him. Should have done more. Instead she—" "You can't save a man from fever," Jacob said flatly. "And you know it. She's his widow. She owes you nothing." Jacob's voice didn't rise, but something in it made the young man take a step back. "And you're going to let her go. Now!" The older man's grip tightened on Elena's hair, jerking her head back. "Or what? You going to fight all of us, stranger, for a woman you don't even know?" Jacob's eyes moved across the crowd. Counted them. 4 in the alley, maybe a dozen watching. More coming, drawn by the commotion. He was one man, unarmed, with nothing but his size and the look in his eyes that said he'd seen worse things than this and survived them. "I don't need to fight you," Jacob said. "I just need to make it clear that if you don't let her go, you'll regret it." Big words from a... Jacob moved. Not to strike, not to grab. He simply stepped between Elena and her tormentors, his body a wall. 6 feet 2 inches of muscle and bone and absolute certainty. The young man stumbled backward. The women holding Elena's arms loosened their grip, uncertain. "She's coming with me," Jacob said. Not a request, not a question. A statement of fact. "You can't. I can. I am." Jacob pulled a knife from his belt, small, sharp, meant for cutting rope and leather. He knelt in front of Elena, careful not to move too fast, and reached for her bound wrists. "Look at me," he said quietly. Her eyes, dark brown and glazed with shock, slowly focused on his face. She was shaking harder now, her breath coming in shallow gasps that might turn into sobs or screams, or both. "I'm going to cut the rope," Jacob said. "Then we're going to stand up, and we're going to walk out of here. You understand?" She blinked. Once, twice. Something flickered behind her eyes, confusion, maybe, or disbelief that anyone would bother. But she nodded. Barely. Just enough. Jacob cut the rope in one smooth motion. It fell away, leaving red marks in her skin. He folded the knife and put it away, then stood, offering his hand. Elena stared at it like she'd forgotten what hands were for. Behind them, the young man was shouting again, his voice high and furious. "You think you can just walk away? You think there won't be consequences? Thomas, stop them!" The older man, Thomas, took a step forward, then stopped. Jacob had turned to face him, and whatever Thomas saw in that face made him reconsider. Jacob had been a soldier once, back when that mattered. He'd killed men in the name of causes he'd stopped believing in, and the weight of those deaths sat behind his eyes like a warning written in a language everyone could read. "You want to stop me," Jacob said quietly. "You're welcome to try." Thomas didn't move. Jacob turned back to Elena and offered his hand again. This time, slowly, her fingers touched his. They were cold despite the heat, and they trembled against his palm. He closed his hand around hers, carefully, gently, and pulled her to her feet. She swayed. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow, feeling the way her whole body was locked up tight, ready to shatter. Her eyes darted to the people holding her, then to the crowd, then back to Jacob's face. "Can you walk?" he asked. Her voice was a rasp, barely audible. "I don't... Just to my horse. Can you do that?" She nodded. He didn't know if she was lying, but it didn't matter. He'd carry her if he had to. They walked. Jacob kept himself between Elena and the alley, his hand still on her elbow, guiding her through the crowd. People stepped back. Some looked ashamed. Most just looked uncomfortable, like they'd witnessed something they'd rather forget. The young man, Elena's late husband's brother, Jacob assumed, kept shouting threats and curses, but nobody moved to help him. "This isn't over," the young man screamed. "You hear me, Elena? This isn't over. You can't run from us." "You can't—" Jacob stopped, turned, fixed the young man with a look that could have frozen water in August. "You follow us. You'll regret it more than you've regretted anything in your life. And that's a promise." The young man's mouth snapped shut. They reached Jacob's horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Red, who'd been through worse things than a screaming crowd. Jacob kept one hand on Elena's arm while he untied the reins with the other. She was leaning against him now, her legs barely holding her weight. Shock wearing off, maybe, letting the pain and exhaustion flood in behind it. "I need to put you on the horse," Jacob said. "I'm going to lift you. Don't fight me." "I can—" But her voice broke, and her knees buckled. Jacob caught her before she fell, one arm around her waist, the other under her knees. She weighed almost nothing. Too thin. Too light. He lifted her into the saddle like she was made of paper, and she clung to the saddle horn with both hands, swaying. He swung up behind her, gathered the reins, and wrapped one arm around her waist to keep her steady. She went rigid at the contact, every muscle locked tight. He kept his touch light, impersonal, just enough to keep her from falling. "Where—" Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "Where are we going?" "Out," Jacob said. "Away from here." "They'll follow." "Let them try." He urged Red into a walk, then a trot, heading out of town toward the open country that stretched endlessly in every direction. Behind them, the crowd was breaking up, people returning to their business with something to talk about over dinner tonight. The young man was still shouting, but his voice was fading, swallowed by distance and the sound of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth. Jacob didn't look back. The ride out of town took 20 minutes. Elena didn't speak, didn't move except for the way her body swayed with the horse's gait. Jacob kept one arm around her, feeling the way she held herself perfectly still, like moving might shatter whatever thin shell was keeping her together. The land opened up around them, rolling hills covered in dry grass, scattered stands of cottonwood, the distant mountains purple against the sky. The sun was starting its slow descent toward evening, turning everything gold and amber. Beautiful country, if you could survive it. Most couldn't. Jacob's ranch was 12 miles north of Creston Falls, tucked into a valley where a creek ran year-round and the land was good enough for cattle and horses. He'd built the cabin himself 5 years ago, after he'd gotten tired of sleeping in bunkhouses and taking orders from men who didn't know half what he did about staying alive. It wasn't much, 2 rooms, a loft, a barn, and a corral, but it was his, and it was far enough from town that he didn't have to pretend to be sociable. They rode in silence. Elena's trembling had eased, replaced by a kind of stillness that worried Jacob more. She was looking at nothing, her eyes fixed on Red's mane, her breathing shallow and mechanical. "What's your name?" Jacob asked, though he already knew. "Elena." The word came out flat, empty. "I'm Jacob. Jacob Hale." No response. "You got people you want me to take you to? Family? Friends?" She shook her head once. Quick. Definitive. "Anyone who'll come looking for you besides those folks back in town?" Another shake. Jacob absorbed that. A widow with no family, no friends, no support except the in-laws who'd just tried to destroy her. He didn't know the full story, but he knew enough. Small towns didn't forgive women who stepped outside the lines, and it sounded like Elena had committed the unforgivable sin of surviving her husband. "We'll figure it out," Jacob said, more to himself than to her. The sun was low on the horizon when the ranch came into view. The cabin sat in a small clearing, backed by the creek and surrounded by open grassland. The barn needed a new roof, and the corral fence was leaning in places, but it was solid, safe, isolated. Jacob reined Red to a stop in front of the cabin and dismounted, then reached up to help Elena down. She moved like a sleepwalker, letting him guide her. Her feet touched the ground and her knees buckled again. He caught her, steadied her, then led her to the porch steps. "Sit," he said. She sat. Jacob tied Red to the porch rail and grabbed his saddlebags, then unlocked the cabin door and pushed it open. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it, spare, clean, functional. A table and 2 chairs. A stove. A narrow bed against one wall. Shelves with supplies. No decorations, no personal touches, just the basics for staying alive. He came back outside with a bucket and headed to the creek, filled it with cold, clear water and carried it back to the porch. Elena hadn't moved. She sat hunched over, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the ground. Jacob set the bucket down beside her and grabbed a clean cloth from inside, dipped it in the water, wrung it out, and held it out to her. "You'll want to wash your face," he said. She looked at the cloth like it was a foreign object. Then slowly, she took it. Her hands were still shaking, but she managed to lift the cloth to her face, pressed it against her eyes, held it there. Her shoulders started to shake. Jacob stood and walked to the far end of the porch, giving her space. He leaned against the railing and looked out at the land, at the last rays of sunlight turning the mountains into shadows. Behind him, he heard soft, choked sounds, the kind of crying that came from someone who'd learned not to make noise, who'd learned that crying too loud brought punishment. He let her cry. There was nothing else to do, nothing to say that would fix what had been done to her. So he stood there, waiting, while the sky turned from gold to pink to deep, bruising purple. When the crying stopped, he turned. Elena was still sitting on the steps, the cloth in her hands, now black with soot. Her face was cleaner, but not clean. The marks they'd made on her were still visible, streaks across her forehead, her cheeks. Her hair, hacked short and uneven, stuck out in all directions. Her split lip had bled onto her chin. "There's a room inside," Jacob said, "and more water. You can clean up properly if you want. I'll be in the barn." Elena looked up at him for the first time since they'd left town. Her eyes, red-rimmed and exhausted, held a question she didn't know how to ask. "You're safe here," Jacob said, answering it. "Nobody's going to hurt you, not while I'm breathing." She stared at him a moment longer, then nodded, slow, uncertain, but a nod. Jacob picked up the bucket and carried it inside, setting it on the table along with a bar of soap and more clean cloths. Elena followed him in, moving carefully, like she expected the floor to give way beneath her feet. She stood in the middle of the room, looking lost. "That's the bed," Jacob said, pointing. "You can use it tonight. I'll sleep in the barn. You don't have to—" "I'm not arguing about it." Jacob's voice was firm but not unkind. "You need rest, a locked door, and I need to check on the horses anyway." He moved toward the door, then stopped, his hand on the frame. "There's bread in the cupboard and dried meat. Help yourself." "And Elena?" She looked at him. "You did nothing wrong. Whatever they told you, whatever they made you believe, you did nothing wrong. You hear me?" Her eyes filled with tears again, but she didn't cry, just nodded. Jacob stepped outside and closed the door behind him, then waited until he heard the soft click of the lock sliding home. Good. She was learning. In this country, locked doors and loaded guns were the difference between living and dying, and he had a feeling Elena had been living too long without either. He walked to the barn, Red following behind him like a dog. Inside, the familiar smell of hay and leather and horse surrounded him. Jacob unsaddled Red, brushed him down, gave him grain and water, then checked on the other two horses and the handful of cattle in the near pasture. Everything was fine. Everything was as it should be, except now there was a broken woman in his cabin, and men in town who wouldn't forget what he'd done, and a future that had gotten a lot more complicated in the space of an hour. Jacob sat on a bale of hay and pulled off his hat, running his hand through his hair. He was 42 years old. He'd fought in the war, worked as a scout, survived things that should have killed him, and built a life out here in the middle of nowhere specifically, so he wouldn't have to deal with other people's problems. And now he'd gone and adopted one. He thought about the look in Elena's eyes when she'd been on her knees in that alley, the way she'd flinched when her brother-in-law grabbed her chin, the way she'd moved through the world like someone who'd learned that taking up space brought pain. He'd seen that before too, on women in army camps, on children in burned-out towns, on soldiers who'd been captured and tortured and somehow lived to talk about it. People broke in different ways. Elena had been broken systematically, deliberately, by people who should have protected her. And something in Jacob, some part of himself he'd thought he'd buried years ago, had woken up and decided that wasn't acceptable. "Damn fool," he muttered to himself. Red snorted in agreement. Jacob stood, stretched, and walked to the barn door. The cabin glowed faintly with lamplight. Inside, Elena was hopefully washing away the marks they'd put on her, maybe eating something, maybe just sitting and trying to remember how to breathe without fear. Tomorrow would bring complications. The family would come, probably. Or the sheriff. Someone would demand answers, demand she be returned, demand Jacob explain why he'd interfered, and Jacob would have to decide how far he was willing to go to keep his word. But tonight, for a few hours at least, Elena could sleep without being hurt. That was something. Small, maybe, but something. Jacob pulled his hat back on and settled against the barn wall, his rifle across his knees. He'd keep watch tonight, just in case. Just because a locked door and a stranger's promise might not be enough against men who believed they had the right to punish a woman for surviving. The stars came out, brilliant and cold. The creek murmured in the darkness. Red shifted in his stall, and somewhere far off, a coyote called to the moon. Jacob sat and waited for morning, wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into, and knowing deep down that he'd do it all again without hesitation. Because some things mattered, some lines couldn't be crossed, and some people deserved a chance to remember what it felt like to be human, even if the world had tried its damnedest to make them forget. Dawn came slowly, bleeding light across the valley in shades of pale gold and gray. Jacob had been awake for hours, watching the darkness fade, listening to the morning sounds, birds stirring, the creek running steady, Red shifting in his stall. His back ached from sitting against the barn wall all night, his rifle still across his knees, his eyes gritty from lack of sleep. Nothing had come in the night, no riders, no threats, just silence and stars, and the weight of a promise he'd made to a woman whose full story he didn't know. He stood, joints protesting, and stretched until something in his spine cracked. The cabin was dark still, no smoke from the chimney, no movement visible through the single window. Either Elena was still asleep, or she was lying awake, too afraid to move. He'd give her time either way. Jacob went through his morning routine, checking the animals, hauling water, splitting wood for the stove. Physical work that required no thought, just muscle and repetition. By the time the sun had cleared the eastern hills, he'd worked up enough sweat to justify washing at the creek. The water was cold enough to make his breath catch, but it cleared his head, sharpened his focus. When he returned to the cabin, smoke was finally rising from the chimney. Jacob paused at the door, knocked twice. "It's me." A long silence. Then the lock clicked and the door opened a crack. Elena's face appeared in the gap, her eyes red-rimmed and cautious. She'd washed thoroughly. The soot marks were gone, revealing skin that was pale and bruised, especially around her left eye, which had swollen nearly shut overnight. Her butchered hair stuck up at odd angles, still damp from washing. "Morning," Jacob said. She stepped back, letting him in. The cabin was warm, the stove radiating heat. She'd made coffee. He could smell it, strong and bitter. The bread and dried meat he'd mentioned were on the table, untouched. She stood near the stove, her arms wrapped around herself, looking like she might bolt if he moved too fast. Jacob hung his hat on the peg by the door and went to pour himself coffee. "You eat anything?" "I'm not hungry." "Didn't ask if you were hungry. Asked if you ate." Elena's jaw tightened. "No." Jacob cut a thick slice of bread, laid strips of dried venison on it, and set it on the table. Then he poured a second cup of coffee and placed it beside the bread. He sat down with his own cup and took a long drink, not looking at her, giving her space to decide. After a minute, she moved to the table, sat, picked up the coffee with both hands and held it like it was the only warm thing in a cold world. She didn't touch the food. "They'll come," Elena said quietly. "Thomas and his sons. They won't let this go." "I know." "You don't understand. They're—" She stopped, her fingers tightening around the cup. "They're respected in town. Thomas Brooks owns the grain warehouse and half the farmland around Creston Falls. What he says matters. What he wants, he gets. Not this time." Elena looked at him directly for the first time, her good eyes searching his face. "Why did you help me? You don't know me, don't know what I did or didn't do. For all you know, everything they said was true." Jacob took another drink of coffee, considering his words. "I was a soldier once. Saw a lot of things I wish I hadn't. One thing I learned, when someone's on their knees and surrounded by people who want to hurt them, The details don't matter much. Right and wrong gets pretty simple in moments like that. They said I let David die. My husband. Her voice was flat, reciting facts. He got sick last spring, fever that wouldn't break. I tried everything, cold compresses, willow bark tea, every remedy I knew. Nothing worked. He died in 3 days. Can't save a man from fever, Jacob said, repeating what he'd told Thomas. Medicine doesn't work that way. They don't see it like that. Thomas says I didn't care for him properly. Says I wanted him dead so I could take his money and leave. Elena's laugh was bitter and broken. David didn't have any money. We barely scraped by. But he had land, 40 acres his father gave him when we married. Thomas wants it back, says it belongs to the family, not to me. What do you say? I say David left it to me in his will, had it written up legal 2 years ago when we thought... She stopped again, her throat working. When we thought there might be a child coming, there wasn't, but the will was valid. The land was mine. Jacob was starting to understand. And you tried to sell it. Elena nodded. I couldn't work it alone, couldn't afford to hire help, and I couldn't stay in that house with Thomas coming by every day, telling me what a failure I was, how I'd disgraced his son's memory, how I owed the family for their generosity in taking me in when I was nothing but a poor orphan girl. So you found a buyer. A man from Colorado, fair price, enough to start over somewhere else, maybe get a job in a city where nobody knew me. Thomas found out. She closed her eyes, her breath shaking. He came to the house with his sons, told me I had no right to sell Brooks' land to strangers, told me I was a thief and a disgrace. They took the deed papers, burned them in front of me, said if I tried to leave town, they'd make sure everyone knew what kind of woman I was. And yesterday? Yesterday I went to the land office anyway, tried to file new papers. Thomas found out before I even left the building. Elena's hand moved to her hair, touching the jagged ends. They dragged me into the alley, said they were going to mark me so everyone would know, so no man would ever want me. So I'd spend the rest of my life alone and ashamed, the way I deserved. The way she said it, flat, emotionless, like she was reading from a script, told Jacob everything he needed to know about how many times she'd heard those words, how deeply they'd burrowed into her mind. You didn't deserve any of that, Jacob said. How do you know? Elena's voice cracked. You don't know me. Don't know what kind of wife I was. Maybe I didn't do enough. Maybe if I'd tried harder, been better. Stop. Jacob's voice was firm enough to cut through the spiral. I know abusers, knew plenty of them in the army, officers who blamed their failures on the men under them, always finding someone weaker to punish. Thomas Brooks is the same breed. Your husband died of fever, and Thomas decided you were easier to blame than fate. Nothing you could have done would have been enough because it was never about what you did. It was about what they wanted, your land, your labor, your obedience. And when you tried to leave, they couldn't allow it because that would mean admitting they were wrong. Elena stared at him, something shifting behind her eyes. Not quite belief, but maybe the first crack in the armor of self-blame she'd been carrying. Eat, Jacob said, nodding to the bread. You're going to need your strength. She picked up the food with trembling fingers and took a small bite. Then another. Jacob finished his coffee and stood, walking to the window. The land stretched out peaceful and empty, but he knew that wouldn't last. What happens now? Elena asked. Now we wait. They'll come today or tomorrow. When they do, we'll deal with it. How? However we have to. Elena set down the bread, her appetite gone. I can leave. I can go somewhere else, somewhere they won't find me. You've done enough already. You shouldn't have to... You're not going anywhere. Jacob turned from the window. Not because I'm keeping you here, but because running won't solve anything. Thomas will still claim you stole from him. Will still tell everyone you're a criminal. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, and men like him don't forget. They hold grudges until they die, and sometimes longer. Then what do? You stand your ground. You make them prove their claims in front of witnesses, and you stop believing their version of who you are. Elena laughed, sharp and humorless. Easy for you to say. You're a man. You can ride into town and drag someone out of an alley, and everyone just steps aside. I'm a woman, a widow. I have no family, no money, no power. My word means nothing. Your word means something to me, Jacob said, and I'm the one with the rifle. The bluntness of it seemed to surprise her. She looked at him for a long moment, and Jacob saw her trying to figure out what kind of man he was, what he wanted from her, what the cost of his protection would be. He'd seen that look before, too. Women learn to calculate those things, learn to measure every man's kindness against the price he'd eventually demand. I don't have anything to give you, Elena said carefully. No money? No skills you'd need on a ranch? I can cook and sew and keep a house, but you seem to manage fine on your own. I don't want anything from you. Everyone wants something. Not everyone. Jacob grabbed his hat. I'm going to ride the fence line, make sure nothing's damaged from that storm last week. You stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. There's a rifle in the corner by the bed. You know how to use one? Elena shook her head. I'll teach you later. For now, just know it's there. He paused at the door. You're safe here, Elena. I meant what I said. Nobody's going to hurt you while I'm alive to prevent it, and I'm a damn hard man to kill. He left before she could respond, pulling the door shut behind him and waiting until he heard the lock slide home. Then he walked to the barn, saddled Red, and rode out across his land with his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. The fence line was fine. Jacob had known it would be. The ride was an excuse to think, to plan, to prepare himself for what was coming. Because Elena was right, Thomas Brooks wouldn't let this go. Men like him never did. Pride and property were everything to men who'd built their worth on controlling others. Jacob had done the math in his head. Thomas had 3 sons. The young one from the alley, plus 2 others. Maybe hired hands. Maybe friends who owed Thomas favors. They'd come with numbers on their side, with legal claims and social authority, and the certainty that they were in the right. All Jacob had was stubbornness and a mean streak he'd been suppressing for 5 years. Might be enough. Might not. He rode back to the ranch mid-morning and found Elena on the porch, a bucket of water beside her, scrubbing at the dress she'd been wearing. The fabric was ruined, torn, stained, beyond saving. But she was scrubbing anyway, her hands moving in fierce, mechanical motions. Jacob dismounted and approached slowly. That's not going to come clean. I know. She kept scrubbing. Elena. I know. The word came out sharp, angry. She threw the dress back into the bucket, water sloshing over the sides. I know it's ruined. I know there's no point. But it's the only dress I have. And I can't just... Her voice broke. Jacob understood. It wasn't about the dress. It was about having nothing, being nothing, having your whole life reduced to the clothes on your back and the charity of a stranger. Wait here, he said. He went inside and dug through the trunk at the foot of his bed. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, were the things he'd kept from his old life, his uniform stained and torn, a bundle of letters, a photograph so faded the faces were barely visible, and beneath it all, folded neatly, 2 dresses, his wife's dresses. Jacob hadn't looked at them in 3 years, hadn't let himself think about Margaret except in the dark hours before dawn when memory ambushed you whether you wanted it or not. She'd died of cholera on the trail west, buried in unmarked ground somewhere in Kansas, while Jacob dug the grave with his bare hands and howled at a sky that didn't care. He lifted the dresses out carefully. One was blue calico, simple and sturdy. The other was gray wool, warmer, better made. Margaret had been tall, slender. The dresses might be a little large on Elena, but they'd fit well enough. He carried them outside and held them out. These should work. Elena stared at the dresses, then at Jacob's face. Where did you get these? They were my wife's. You're married? Was. She died 6 years ago. Jacob's voice was steady, factual. He'd learned to talk about it without falling apart. She'd want them used. No point letting good fabric go to waste. Elena reached out slowly, her fingers touching the blue calico. I can't take your wife's clothes. You can and you will, unless you want to spend the next week in that ruined dress. I'll pay you back. Somehow. Stop talking about payment. I don't want your money, and I don't keep ledgers on kindness. Jacob pushed the dresses into her hands. Put them on. See if they fit. There's a needle and thread in the cabinet if you need to adjust them. He walked away before she could argue further, heading to the barn to give her privacy. He'd expected the dresses to bring up old grief, old pain, but instead he felt something else. Relief, maybe. Like Margaret's things had been waiting for someone who needed them, and now they'd found their purpose. An hour later, Elena emerged wearing the blue calico. It hung loose on her thin frame, the hem dragging slightly, but she'd tucked and pinned it to fit better. She'd also washed her face again and tried to comb her butchered hair into some kind of order. It didn't help much, the cuts were too uneven, too short in places, but she looked more like a person and less like a victim. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jacob nodded. "Suits you." The afternoon passed in tense quiet. Jacob worked on repairs around the ranch while Elena stayed close to the cabin, watching the horizon like she expected an army to appear at any moment. He couldn't blame her. The fear she carried was learned, earned through hard experience. It would take time to unlearn, if she ever did. Sunset was an hour away when Jacob saw the dust. 3 riders coming from the direction of town, moving at a steady pace that said they knew where they were going and weren't in any hurry to get there. Jacob set down his hammer and walked to the cabin. "Elena, inside. Now." She'd seen them too. Her face had gone pale, her hands clenching into fists. "Is it them?" "Don't know yet, but we're not taking chances." He ushered her inside, then pulled his rifle from its place by the door. "Stay away from the windows. If shooting starts, get on the floor and stay there." "Jacob, I'll handle it." He stepped outside, closed the door, and took up position on the porch with the rifle across his knees. The riders came closer. Jacob's eyes picked out details. Thomas Brooks on a gray mare, recognizable by his bulk and his beard. 2 younger men flanking him. Not the hothead from the alley, thankfully. These 2 looked harder, older. Hired guns, maybe, or sons who'd learned their father's cruelty and refined it. They stopped 20 yards from the cabin, well within rifle range. Thomas dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. Showing he wasn't armed, wasn't a threat. The other 2 stayed mounted, their hands resting on their saddle horns, close to their weapons but not reaching. Yet. "Jacob Hale!" Thomas called out. His voice was deep, measured, the tone of a man used to being obeyed. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I have a woman who belongs to herself," Jacob called back. "Nothing of yours on my property." "That woman is my late son's widow. She's family. She has obligations. She has rights, including the right not to be beaten in public." Thomas's expression didn't change. What happened in town was unfortunate. Emotions were high. We were all grieving my son's death, and seeing his widow try to sell his land to strangers, our family land, it was too much. We reacted poorly. I admit that. You admit you assaulted her. I admit things got out of hand. But that doesn't change the facts. Elena is family. She belongs with us, not hiding on some stranger's ranch. Thomas took a step forward. "I'm prepared to be reasonable. She can come back to town, and we'll handle this matter properly. Through the courts if necessary. But she needs to come back." "She doesn't want to go back," Jacob said, "and I'm not making her." One of the mounted men spoke up, his voice hard. "You're harboring someone accused of theft. That makes you an accomplice." "What theft? Selling her own property?" "Property that was never legally hers," Thomas said. "David's will was improperly filed. The land reverts to the family estate." "That's not what the land office says." "The land office made an error. It will be corrected." Thomas's voice took on an edge. "Mr. Hale, I understand you're a solitary man. You keep to yourself. You don't make trouble. I respect that. But you're inserting yourself into a family matter you don't understand. Elena is not what she appears. She's manipulative, ungrateful, and has already tried to turn you against us with lies about persecution." "Saw the persecution myself," Jacob said. "Hard to lie about that." "What you saw was justice. Rough, perhaps, but justice, nonetheless." Thomas spread his hands. "I'm trying to resolve this peacefully. But if you continue to harbor her, if you continue to interfere, there will be consequences. Legal consequences. Sheriff Patterson is a friend of mine. He can make life very difficult for a man living alone out here." Jacob stood slowly, deliberately, the rifle still in his hands but not aimed at anyone. Not yet. Thomas Brooks, I'm going to say this once, so you listen carefully. That woman in my cabin is staying here of her own free will. She's not your property. She's not your prisoner. And if you or your sons or anyone else tries to take her by force, I will stop you, permanently. Is that clear? The mounted men's hands moved closer to their guns. Thomas held up a hand, stopping them. You'd kill over a woman you barely know? A woman who's lied to you, who's using you? I'd kill over a principle, Jacob said. The principle that says a person gets to decide their own life. Elena wants to stay here. She stays. She wants to leave. She leaves. But nobody drags her anywhere against her will. Not while I'm breathing. Thomas's face darkened. You're making a mistake. I've made plenty. I'll survive one more. For a long moment, nobody moved. The air was thick with the possibility of violence, that electric feeling that came right before someone drew a gun and everything went to hell. Jacob kept his breathing steady, his muscles loose. If it came to shooting, he'd take Thomas first, then the mounted men. Might get them all before they got him, might not. Then Thomas stepped back, remounting his horse in one smooth motion. This isn't over. I'll be back with the sheriff. We'll see how brave you are when the law comes calling. I'll be here, Jacob said. The three riders turned and rode off, back toward town, leaving dust and threats hanging in the air. Jacob watched until they disappeared over the hill, then lowered the rifle and let out a breath he'd been holding. The door opened behind him. Elena stood there, her face white, her hands shaking. He'll do it. He'll come back with the sheriff and men with guns, and I know. Jacob, you should let me go. This is my fight, not yours. You don't have to. He turned to face her. Do you want to go? The question stopped her. She opened her mouth, closed it, her eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. No, she whispered. No, I don't want to go. But I don't want you to die for me either. Nobody's dying today. Jacob walked past her into the cabin, setting the rifle back in its place. Tomorrow might be different, but we'll handle that when it comes. Elena followed him inside, closing the door and leaning against it like her legs wouldn't hold her. Why are you doing this? Really? Nobody risks their life for a stranger without a reason. Jacob poured himself water from the bucket, drank it down. You want the truth? Yes. I spent 3 years in the war shooting men I didn't know for reasons I didn't understand. When it was over, I came out here to get away from people, from violence, from having to make decisions about who lived and died. I thought I could just exist, mind my own business, let the world do whatever it wanted as long as it left me alone. He set down the cup. But yesterday I saw a woman on her knees being destroyed by people who thought they had the right. And I remembered why I fought in the first place. Not for causes or flags or any of that horse shit, but because some things are worth stopping, some cruelties are worth standing against even if it costs you. Elena's voice was barely audible. And I'm worth that cost? Every person is worth that cost. Jacob met her eyes. You, me, anyone who just wants to live their life without being ground down by people who think power gives them permission. Thomas Brooks thinks he owns you because you married his son. He's wrong. And I'm going to make sure he understands that, whatever it takes. Silence fell between them, heavy with words neither of them knew how to say. Outside, the sun finally touched the horizon, painting the world in shades of amber and shadow. Another day survived. Another night to get through. Elena straightened, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Then I need to learn to shoot. If they're coming back with more men, I should be able to defend myself. Jacob almost smiled. Almost. Now you're thinking. We'll start lessons tomorrow morning. For tonight, we rest. They ate in near silence, beans and cornbread, simple food that filled the belly without requiring much effort. Elena moved around the cabin with careful efficiency, washing dishes, banking the fire for the night. Small domestic actions that seemed to steady her, give her something to control when everything else was chaos. When full dark fell, Jacob went through his nightly routine, checking the barn, securing the animals, scanning the horizon for movement. Nothing. Just stars and silence and the permanent ache in his shoulders that came from being ready for violence. He returned to find Elena sitting at the table, the gray wool dress in her lap, needle and thread in hand. She was taking in the seams, her stitches small and precise despite her shaking hands. You should sleep, Jacob said. Can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. Thomas holding me down, the scissors, the way everyone just watched. Her needle moved faster. If I'm working, I can't think about it. Jacob pulled out the other chair and sat. Tell me about David. Elena's hands stilled. Why? Because Thomas is going to use him as a weapon. Going to tell everyone you were a terrible wife, that David's death was your fault. I'd like to know the truth. She was quiet for a long time, her eyes on the dress. Then, slowly, she began to speak. David was kind, quiet. He loved his land, loved working with his hands. We married when I was 17. I was working at the hotel in town, cleaning rooms. He came in one day, asked if I wanted to have dinner. I said yes because... She paused, searching for words. Because he didn't look at me like I was something to use and throw away. He looked at me like I was a person. You loved him? I cared for him. I tried to be a good wife, but love... Elena's voice dropped. I don't know if I knew what love was supposed to feel like. I just knew David was decent and safe, and that was more than most women could hope for. When did things change? When his father started visiting more. After the first year, when no children came. Thomas would sit at our table and talk about how important it was to continue the family line, how a wife's primary duty was bearing sons. David would just sit there, not saying anything, while his father dissected everything I did wrong. Her stitches pulled tight, puckering the fabric. Then David got sick, and nothing I did was enough. Thomas brought in his own remedies, his own doctor. When David died anyway, Thomas decided it was my fault for not trying hard enough, for not loving him enough, for being a failure as a wife. That's not how illness works. I know that. You know that. Thomas doesn't care. Elena looked up, her eyes hard. He wanted me gone from the moment David died. But he also wanted the land, so he tried to make me so miserable I'd just give it to him and leave. When I wouldn't, when I tried to sell it instead, Her voice cracked. He decided to destroy me. Jacob absorbed that, all of it, filing away the details. Not just a family dispute, a calculated campaign of destruction against a woman who dared to want something for herself. Tomorrow, we're riding to town, Jacob said, to see the sheriff. Elena's head snapped up. What? No. Jacob, the sheriff is Thomas's friend. He won't help me. Maybe not, but we're going to make him choose a side anyway. Because if Thomas comes back here with legal authority, I need to know whether Sheriff Patterson is coming as law enforcement or as Thomas's hired gun. There's a difference, and it matters. And if he sides with Thomas, then we know where we stand. Jacob stood, his decision made. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. He moved toward the door, but Elena's voice stopped him. Jacob? Thank you for believing me, for... She gestured helplessly at the cabin, at everything. For this. He nodded once, then stepped outside into the night, leaving her with the lamplight and the dress she was mending with careful, determined hands. The hands of a woman who was learning, slowly, that she didn't have to accept destruction as her fate, that some fights were worth having, even when the odds looked impossible, and that sometimes salvation came in the form of a stubborn man with a rifle who'd simply decided that enough was enough. Morning came with clouds building on the western horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. Jacob stood on the porch watching them roll in, coffee cup in hand, his mind already working through the day ahead. Behind him, he heard Elena moving in the cabin, the soft sounds of someone trying to be quiet in an unfamiliar space. She emerged wearing the gray wool dress, her hair still a disaster, but her face set with determination that hadn't been there yesterday. She'd slept, he could tell. Not well, probably, but enough to put some steel back in her spine. We leaving soon? She asked. After breakfast. It's a 2-hour ride to town, and I want to get there before noon. Jacob handed her his coffee cup. Drink. You'll need it. She took it without argument, her fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic. What exactly are we going to say to the sheriff? The truth, that Thomas and his sons assaulted you, that you're pressing charges, and that any attempt to remove you from my property by force will be met with appropriate resistance. Jacob walked past her into the cabin, pulling his gun belt from its peg. He'd stopped wearing it years ago, but today seemed like a good day to break that habit. We're going to make this legal in public. Harder for Thomas to make you disappear if everyone knows you're fighting back." Elena watched him strap on the belt, the weight of the Colt settling familiar against his hip. "And if the sheriff refuses to help, then we'll know he's not actually the law, just Thomas's dog." Jacob checked the cylinder, counted rounds out of habit. "Either way, we make him state his position in front of witnesses." They ate quickly, cold cornbread and the last of yesterday's coffee, then saddled both horses. Jacob had a second mount, a smaller mare named Rosie who'd been getting lazy without regular work. Elena climbed into the saddle with the stiff movements of someone who hadn't ridden in a while, but she settled in and gathered the reins with competent hands. The ride to Creston Falls was quiet at first, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The clouds kept building, and the air had that electric feel that came before storms. The horses sensed it, ears flicking constantly, steps a little quicker than normal. An hour out, Elena spoke. "What will you do if this doesn't work? If the sheriff sides with Thomas and they come for me anyway?" Jacob kept his eyes on the horizon. "Fight. That's not a plan." "It's the only plan I've got." He glanced at her. "Unless you've got a better one." "I could leave. Go north, maybe. Montana Territory? Somewhere Thomas's reach doesn't extend. Running just makes you prey. Prey gets caught eventually." Jacob shifted in his saddle. "You want to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, jumping at shadows, never settling anywhere because you're afraid they'll find you?" "No." Her voice was small. "But I don't want you dead either. I'm harder to kill than I look. Jacob, I'm serious. These men, they're not going to just give up. Thomas has money, influence, friends in high places. You're one man with a ranch and a rifle. The odds aren't—" "The odds never are." Jacob cut her off, not unkindly. "I learned that in the war, good men died while bastards lived. Fair fights were myths. The only thing that mattered was whether you were willing to stand when everyone else ran." He looked at her directly. "I'm standing. Question is, are you?" Elena's jaw tightened. "I'm here, aren't I? You're here because I dragged you out of that alley. I need to know if you're here because you want to fight or because you don't know what else to do." The question hung between them, sharp and necessary. Elena's hands tightened on the reins, her knuckles white. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the fear underneath. "I'm tired of being afraid. Tired of making myself small so men like Thomas don't notice me. Tired of apologizing for existing." She met his eyes. "If fighting back means I might die, fine. At least I'll die standing up." Jacob nodded slowly. That was the answer he'd needed to hear. "Good. Because what we're about to do is going to make things worse before they get better. Once we walk into that sheriff's office, there's no taking it back. Thomas will know you're not running, and he'll come at you harder. Let him." There was something new in Elena's voice, something fierce. "I spent a year letting him tear me apart piece by piece. I'm done bleeding quietly." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the heavy quiet of fear, but the focused stillness of people preparing for battle. The clouds continued their advance, turning the sky the color of old bruises. Creston Falls appeared on the horizon just before noon, its buildings small and dusty under the threatening sky. Jacob felt Elena tense beside him as they approached, her shoulders going rigid, her breathing shallow. He understood. The last time she'd been here, she'd been dragged into an alley and destroyed in front of everyone she knew. "Head up," Jacob said quietly. "Eyes forward. You've got nothing to be ashamed of." "Everyone will stare." "Let them. You're not the one who should feel shame here." They rode down Main Street at a deliberate pace, not hurrying, not hiding. People did stare. Shopkeepers in doorways, women with baskets, men outside the saloon. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as they passed. Jacob watched their faces, surprise, curiosity, some disgust, a little fear. News had spread clearly. Everyone knew what had happened, and everyone had an opinion. Jacob ignored them all, keeping his focus on the sheriff's office at the far end of the street. It was a squat building with barred windows and a hand-painted sign that had faded to near illegibility. 2 horses were tied out front, and Jacob recognized one of them, Thomas's gray mare. "He's already here," Elena breathed. "Good. Saves us the trouble of having the same conversation twice. Jacob dismounted and tied Red to the hitching post, then helped Elena down. Her legs were shaking, but she stood straight, her chin up. Remember what I said. Tell the truth. Don't apologize. Don't back down. She nodded, her face pale but determined. Jacob pushed open the door and walked in first, positioning himself so Elena was slightly behind him. The office was small, cluttered with wanted posters and paperwork. A desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it sat a man Jacob recognized from his few trips to town. Sheriff William Patterson, mid-50s, heavy around the middle, with the tired eyes of someone who'd been doing the same job too long. Thomas Brooks stood to the right, his two sons flanking him. The hothead from the alley was there too, his face lighting up with vindictive pleasure when he saw Elena. "Well," Thomas said, "looks like the lost sheep has returned to the fold." "She's not lost, and she's not yours," Jacob said flatly. He turned to the sheriff. "We're here to file charges: assault, battery, unlawful restraint, and destruction of property." Patterson's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious list of accusations, Mr. Hale." "It's a serious situation, Sheriff," Jacob gestured to Elena. "This woman was attacked in public 3 days ago by Thomas Brooks and his sons. They cut her hair, beat her, and marked her face. I witnessed it myself, as did about 30 other people in town." "It was a family matter," Thomas interjected smoothly. "A private discipline for—" "There's nothing private about dragging someone into an alley in broad daylight and assaulting them in front of half the town," Jacob cut him off. "And there's no law that says you can beat a woman for trying to sell her own property." Patterson held up a hand. "Let's all settle down here. Thomas, you want to tell me your side?" "My side is simple, Sheriff. Elena is my late son's widow. As such, she has certain obligations to the family. When she attempted to sell land that rightfully belongs to the Brooks estate, we intervened. Things got heated. I admit we may have been too forceful in our correction, but the underlying issue remains. She has no legal right to that land." "I have the deed," Elena said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. All eyes turned to her. "David left the land to me in a properly filed will. I have documentation from the land office confirming my ownership. Thomas burned my original papers, but I obtained copies." She pulled a folded document from her pocket and placed it on the sheriff's desk. Patterson picked it up, scanned it, his frown deepening. "This appears legitimate," he said slowly. "It's a forgery," Thomas's youngest son spat. "She probably paid someone to create false documents." "Or," Jacob said, "she's telling the truth, and you're the ones trying to steal her property through intimidation and violence." Patterson set down the document and rubbed his face. "This is getting complicated." "It's not complicated at all," Jacob said. "A woman was attacked. I want the attackers arrested and charged. That's what the law is for, isn't it? Mr. Hale, I appreciate your concern, but you need to understand this is a family matter. These kinds of disputes are usually handled privately, not through the courts. Assault isn't a family matter. It's a crime. In theory, yes, but in practice—" Patterson's eyes shifted to Thomas, then back to Jacob. "In practice, things are more nuanced. Thomas is a respected businessman, a pillar of this community. His son died, and emotions ran high. I'm not saying what happened was right, but I'm also not convinced it rises to the level of criminal charges." Jacob felt his jaw tighten. There it was, the line in the sand. Patterson had just revealed whose side he was on, and it wasn't justice. "So you're refusing to file charges," Jacob said flatly. "I'm saying I need more time to investigate, to talk to witnesses, to get a fuller picture of the situation." Patterson stood, his body language shifting to dismissal. "In the meantime, I'd recommend Elena return to her family and work this out like reasonable people." "She's not going back to them," Jacob said. Thomas stepped forward, his voice hardening. "She doesn't have a choice. She's family, and she has obligations. She's a grown woman with legal rights. She doesn't have to go anywhere she doesn't want to. And you don't have the authority to harbor her against her family's wishes," Thomas shot back. "Sheriff, this man has taken my daughter-in-law and is holding her on his property, possibly against her will. I want her returned immediately." Elena's voice rang out, clear and strong. I'm not being held against my will. I'm staying with Jacob because I'm afraid of what you'll do to me if I go back. You see, Sheriff? Thomas spread his hands. She's been poisoned against her own family. This man has filled her head with lies, turned her against the people who only want what's best for her. What's best for me? Elena's voice rose. You held me down and cut my hair. You beat me in front of the entire town. You told me I was worthless, that I deserved to die alone and ashamed. And you want me to believe you care about what's best for me? We were teaching you a lesson, Thomas's youngest son snarled. You need to learn respect. You need to learn... Enough! Patterson's voice cut through the rising tension. Everyone needs to calm down before this gets out of hand. It's already out of hand, Jacob said. The question is whether you're going to uphold the law or enable these men to continue terrorizing a woman who's done nothing wrong. Patterson's face reddened. Don't presume to lecture me about the law, Mr. Hale. I've been sheriff for 15 years. I know my job. Then do it. The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. Patterson stared at Jacob, measuring him, trying to decide if this was a fight worth having. Finally, he spoke, his voice careful. Elena, are you claiming you're in danger if you return to the Brooks family? Yes. No hesitation, no doubt. And you're staying with Mr. Hale of your own free will? Yes. Patterson nodded slowly. Then legally, there's nothing I can do to force you to leave his property. You're a widow, not a minor. You have the right to choose where you live. He turned to Thomas. And you, Thomas, need to leave her alone. No more visits, no more confrontations. If you have a legal dispute about the land, take it to a judge. But the physical intimidation stops now. Thomas's face darkened. Sheriff, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Patterson's voice hardened. I'm not filing assault charges because I don't think a jury would convict based on a family dispute. But I'm also not going to stand by and watch you harass a woman who's made it clear she wants nothing to do with you. You leave her be, or next time I will file charges. Are we clear? The threat was barely a threat. Patterson was trying to split the difference, keep everyone happy, avoid taking a real stand. But it was something, a line drawn, however faint. Thomas stared at the sheriff for a long moment, then turned his cold gaze on Elena. This isn't over. That land is mine by right, and I will have it. If not through family obligation, then through the courts. And when I win, and I will win, you'll have nothing. Nowhere to go. No one to protect you. She'll still have me, Jacob said quietly. Thomas's laugh was bitter. For how long? Until the novelty wears off? Until you realize what a burden she is. Men like you don't sacrifice for women like her unless you're getting something in return. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something ugly. What's she giving you, Hale? What's the price for your protection? Jacob moved before he'd fully decided to. 3 steps closed the distance between them, and his hand wrapped around Thomas's collar, slamming the older man back against the wall hard enough to rattle the wanted posters. Thomas's son started forward, but Jacob's other hand was already on his Colt, and the message was clear. Come closer and find out what happens. Listen to me very carefully, Jacob said, his voice soft and deadly. You can question my motives. You can threaten me. You can try to kill me if you're feeling brave. But you ever imply that Elena is anything less than a woman deserving of respect and dignity, I will put you in the ground, sheriff or no sheriff, witnesses or no witnesses. Do you understand me? Thomas's face had gone purple, his hands scrabbling at Jacob's grip. You're threatening me in front of... I'm making a promise. Jacob released him, stepping back. Thomas sagged against the wall, gasping. Stay away from her. Stay away from my property. And keep your disgusting assumptions to yourself. Patterson was on his feet, hand on his own weapon. Mr. Hale, I could arrest you for that. You could, Jacob agreed. But you won't, because that would require you to actually take a stand, and we both know you're not going to do that. He turned to Elena. We're done here. Let's go. Elena followed him to the door, her head high despite the trembling in her hands. Behind them, Thomas was still gasping, his sons helping him stand, their faces twisted with rage and humiliation. This isn't over, Thomas shouted after them. You hear me, Hale? This isn't over. Jacob didn't respond. He pushed through the door and into the street, Elena right behind him. The sky had darkened further, and the first drops of rain were starting to fall. Fat, heavy drops that hit the dust like bullets. They'd barely reached the horses when the heavens opened up. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking them instantly, turning the street into a river of mud. Jacob grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her under the nearest awning, the general store, while the storm raged around them. Elena was laughing. It started as a giggle, then grew into full gasping laughter that bordered on hysteria. Jacob stared at her, wondering if she'd finally broken, but when she looked at him, her eyes were bright with something that looked like freedom. "Did you see his face?" she gasped between laughs. "When you slammed him against the wall? Did you see?" "I saw. I've never seen anyone." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't express what it meant to watch someone defend her like she mattered, like she was worth protecting. The laughter dissolved into tears and she covered her face with her hands. Jacob stood awkwardly, unsure what to do. Comforting people had never been his strength. But Elena needed something, some acknowledgement that what had just happened mattered, so he placed one hand on her shoulder. Light, brief, gone before she could flinch away. "You did good in there," he said. "Stood up for yourself, told the truth. That took courage." It didn't change anything. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Patterson didn't file charges. Thomas still wants the land. We're right back where we started." "No, we're not. We made it public. Made Patterson choose a side even if he chose poorly, and we proved to Thomas that you're not alone anymore." Jacob watched the rain hammer down. "That matters. Maybe not legally, but it matters." "What happens now?" "Now Thomas will file a legal challenge to your land ownership. He'll try to prove the will is invalid or that you have no right to sell. Could take months to resolve." "Months of waiting, months of looking over my shoulder." "Probably." Jacob pulled his hat lower against the rain. "But you'll be alive and free. That's worth something." Elena was quiet for a moment, watching the storm. Then she spoke, her voice thoughtful. "You threatened to kill him. In front of the sheriff. You could go to jail for that." "Worth it." "Why? Why risk so much for someone you barely know?" Jacob considered the question. Not the surface answer, the easy justifications about right and wrong, but the deeper truth underneath. Why had he stepped into that alley? Why was he standing here now, soaking wet, having made enemies of powerful men for the sake of a stranger? "My wife died on the trail west," he said finally. "Cholera. She was sick for 3 days before she died, and there was nothing I could do. Just watch her fade. When it was over, I buried her and kept moving because that's what you do. You survive. You keep going." He paused, searching for words. "But survival isn't the same as living. And I realized, standing in that alley watching you on your knees, that I'd stopped living years ago. I'd just been surviving, going through the motions, pretending that was enough. And helping me change that, it reminded me that some things are worth fighting for, that I could still be the kind of man who steps in instead of walking away." Jacob looked at her directly. "You don't owe me anything for that. I'm not keeping score, He struggled to articulate it. "I'm just trying to be the man my wife thought I was, before I let grief turn me into someone who didn't care about anything." Elena's eyes were wet, but not from rain. "She would have been proud of you for what you did." "Maybe." Jacob pushed away from the wall. "Rain's letting up. We should go before it starts again." They mounted their horses and rode out of town through the mud and drizzle, both of them aware that eyes were watching from windows and doorways. Let them watch. Let them talk. Elena had stopped hiding, and Jacob had stopped pretending he didn't care. The ride back was slower, the horses picking their way carefully through the slick ground. The storm had cooled the air, and by the time they reached the ranch, the sun was trying to break through the clouds, creating strange patterns of light and shadow across the valley. Jacob helped Elena dismount, noting the way exhaustion had settled into her bones. The confrontation had cost her more than she'd let on in town. "Go inside, get dry. I'll handle the horses." She nodded and walked to the cabin, her steps heavy. Jacob unsaddled both horses, rubbed them down, made sure they had feed and water. Simple task that gave him time to think about what came next. Thomas would regroup, would come at them from a different angle. Legal, probably, but maybe not. Men like Thomas didn't take humiliation well. Jacob had embarrassed him in front of his sons, in front of the sheriff, in front of witnesses. That kind of wound festered. He was checking the fence line near the creek when he heard it, the sound of hoofbeats, multiple riders, coming fast. Jacob's hand went to his Colt, his body tensing. Too soon for Thomas to be back, unless he'd been waiting just outside town. Unless the confrontation in the sheriff's office had been the final straw. Jacob ran for the cabin, covering the distance in seconds. He burst through the door, startling Elena, who was standing by the stove with a cup of tea. "Riders coming, multiple. Get the rifle." Her face went pale, but she moved quickly, grabbing the rifle from the corner. Jacob positioned himself by the window, peering out through the gap in the curtains. 4 riders, coming hard, their horses lathered. Not Thomas's men, different horses. And leading them, Jacob's breath caught. Sheriff Patterson. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin in a spray of mud and gravel. Patterson dismounted, 3 deputies with him. Jacob recognized one, a young man named Miller who'd been sheriff's deputy for less than a year. The other 2 were older, harder looking. Hired guns, probably. Jacob stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, but not aimed at anyone. Yet. "Sheriff, this is unexpected." Patterson's face was grim. "Jacob Hale, I'm here to place you under arrest for assault and terroristic threatening." Elena appeared in the doorway behind Jacob, her face white with shock. "What?" "No, he was defending—" "Stay inside, ma'am." Patterson's voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "Mr. Hale, you're going to need to come with us. Thomas Brooks has filed formal charges. Judge Morrison has issued a warrant." Jacob felt the world narrow down to a single point of clarity. Thomas hadn't waited for a legal challenge to the land. He'd gone straight for the throat, using the one weapon Jacob had given him. The confrontation in the sheriff's office. One man grabbing another by the collar, threatening violence in front of law enforcement. Stupid. Jacob had been stupid and let his temper override his judgment. "How much did Thomas pay for that warrant?" Jacob asked flatly. Patterson's jaw tightened. "That's not how this works." "Isn't it?" Jacob gestured with the rifle, not pointing it but making its presence known. "You wouldn't file charges when Elena was beaten in public, but you've got a warrant ready the same day I defend her. Seems like Morrison's justice is for sale and Thomas is buying." "The law is the law, Mr. Hale. You can argue about it in court, but right now you need to put down that rifle and come with us." Jacob's mind raced through options. He could fight. 4 against 1 weren't good odds, but he'd faced worse. If he killed Patterson and the deputies, he and Elena could run. North to Montana, maybe. Or west to California. Disappear into the territories where law was just a word people used to justify their prejudices. But running would prove Thomas right. Would make Jacob an outlaw, make Elena a fugitive. They'd spend the rest of their lives hiding, and Thomas would win by default. "Jacob, don't!" Elena's voice was quiet, but steady behind him. "Don't do this, please." He looked back at her, saw the fear in her eyes, but also something else. Trust. She was trusting him to make the right choice, not the easy one. Jacob lowered the rifle slowly, carefully, and propped it against the porch railing. "How long?" "Court dates in 3 days. Judge Morrison wants this settled quickly." Patterson gestured to his deputies. "I'm going to need your sidearm, too." Jacob unbuckled his gun belt and handed it over. One of the deputies immediately moved forward with rope to bind his hands. Jacob submitted without resistance, his eyes locked on Elena's face. "You'll be okay," he told her. "The ranch is yours until I get back. There's food in the cellar, firewood in the barn. If anyone comes, Thomas or anyone else, you lock the door and don't open it." "They're going to kill you." Elena's voice cracked. "Thomas won't let you get to trial. He won't." But Jacob wasn't sure. Patterson might be Thomas's friend, but murder was a different level of crime. Then again, men had died in jail before. Accidents happened. Suicides. Falls down stairs that left prisoners conveniently dead before they could testify. The deputy finished tying Jacob's hands, pulling the knots tight enough to bite. Patterson took Jacob's arm. "Let's go." Jacob allowed himself to be led to a horse, helped up into the saddle despite the bound hands. Elena stood on the porch, the rifle at her feet. her face a mask of barely controlled terror. 3 days, Jacob called back to her. I'll be back in 3 days. You hold on until then. She nodded, but tears were streaming down her face. They rode out, Jacob surrounded by armed men, his hands bound, his freedom gone. Behind them, Elena stood alone on the porch of a cabin that wasn't hers. On land she was fighting to keep, facing enemies who wanted to destroy her. Jacob had promised to protect her, and now he was leaving her to face it all alone. As they crested the hill and the ranch disappeared from view, Jacob made himself a new promise. However this ended, whether he lived or died, whether Thomas won or lost, he would make sure Elena survived, that she got her life back, her land, her freedom, even if it cost him everything. The storm that had been building all day finally broke open again, rain pouring down like tears from an angry sky, washing away the dust and leaving everything clean and raw and new. The jail cell was smaller than Jacob remembered from his one previous visit years ago, and it smelled of old sweat, rust, and despair. 8 feet by 6, with a narrow cot bolted to the wall and a bucket in the corner that hadn't been emptied in too long. The single window was barred and too high to see anything but a square of darkening sky. Patterson had locked him in without ceremony, removed the ropes from his wrists, and left without meeting his eyes. The 3 deputies had dispersed to other duties, and now Jacob stood alone in the cell, rubbing circulation back into his hands and taking inventory of his situation. Not good. Not good at all. He'd been arrested on charges that would normally warrant a fine and a warning, but Thomas had money and influence. The judge was Morrison, who owned the bank and had business dealings with Thomas. The trial was in 3 days, barely enough time to mount a defense, even if Jacob had a lawyer, which he didn't, and Elena was alone at the ranch with no protection except a rifle she barely knew how to use. Jacob sat on the cot, springs groaning under his weight, and forced himself to think clearly. Panic wouldn't help. Anger wouldn't help. He needed strategy, leverage, something to shift the balance. The problem was simple. He had nothing. No money for bribes or lawyers, no friends in positions of power, no evidence that would prove Thomas's corruption beyond what everyone already knew and chose to ignore. Just his word against Thomas Brooks, and in Creston Falls, that was no contest. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Jacob stood, positioning himself away from the bars, giving whoever was coming no easy target. The footsteps stopped, and Sheriff Patterson appeared, a tray in his hands with a tin plate of food and a cup of water. "Dinner?" Patterson said, sliding the tray through the slot at the bottom of the bars. Jacob didn't move to take it. "You gonna tell me what Thomas paid you?" Patterson's face hardened. "Nobody paid me anything. You committed a crime. I arrested you. That's how law works." "That's how it's supposed to work. What actually happened is Thomas got embarrassed and bought himself some revenge." Jacob stepped closer to the bars. "How much did Morrison get?" "Because I know he's involved. You don't issue a warrant that fast without somebody greasing the wheels. You're in enough trouble without adding disrespect to a judge." Patterson turned to leave. "How many women has Thomas destroyed?" Jacob asked. The question stopped the sheriff mid-step. "How many has he beaten, terrorized, driven out of town, while you looked the other way? Elena's not the first, is she?" Patterson turned slowly. "What Elena Brooks did or didn't suffer is between her and her family. She watched her husband die, then got punished for surviving him. And you let it happen. You let Thomas drag her into an alley and cut her hair off while half the town watched. You're the law, Patterson. You're supposed to protect people." "I protect this town," Patterson's voice rose. "You know what would happen if I arrested Thomas Brooks? His business would leave, jobs would disappear, the grain warehouse would close. Half the farms around here depend on his operation. This town needs him. More than it needs justice? Justice is a luxury." Patterson's face was weary, and for a moment Jacob saw the man underneath the badge. Someone who'd made compromises so long he'd forgotten why he started. "You think I like this? You think I enjoy watching men like Thomas do whatever they want? But I have to think about the bigger picture, about what keeps people fed and alive. Elena needs to eat and stay alive too. Elena can go somewhere else, start over. She's young enough, smart enough. She'll survive." Patterson shook his head. "But if Thomas falls, this whole town falls with him. I can't allow that." Jacob understood then. Patterson wasn't corrupt, not exactly. He was practical. He'd calculated that one woman's suffering was acceptable collateral damage for the town's economic stability. It was the same calculus Jacob had seen in the war, officers sacrificing units to win battles, commanders burning towns to starve armies, the logic of men who'd learned to measure lives against outcomes. "You're wrong," Jacob said quietly. "Towns that build themselves on letting powerful men do whatever they want, those towns are already dead. They just don't know it yet." Patterson had no answer for that. He left, his footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving Jacob alone with cold food and colder thoughts. Night fell. Jacob forced himself to eat, to drink the water, to keep his strength up. The cell grew dark except for the faint moonlight through the high window. He lay on the cot, staring at shadows, thinking about Elena alone at the ranch. Had she locked the door? Was she sleeping or lying awake, listening for sounds of approach? Did she think he'd abandoned her, left her to face Thomas alone? The thought gnawed at him. She'd trusted him, had put her faith in a stranger because he'd shown her one moment of decency in a world that had shown her mostly cruelty. And now he was locked in a cell, powerless, while she faced whatever came next without him. Morning arrived with gray light and the sound of the town waking up outside. Jacob heard wagons, voices, the general noise of a frontier settlement going about its business. Patterson brought breakfast, more thin porridge and weak coffee, but didn't stay to talk. The day dragged. Jacob paced the cell, counted his steps, did exercises to keep his muscles from going stiff. Anything to keep his mind occupied, to stop the spiral of worry about Elena, about what Thomas might do while Jacob was conveniently locked away. Afternoon brought a visitor Jacob hadn't expected. A woman appeared at the bars, middle-aged, dressed in dark blue with her hair pulled back severe. She carried herself with the posture of someone used to being obeyed. Jacob recognized her vaguely. Mrs. Charlotte Brennan, wife of the man who owned the hotel. She studied him with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I'm here to offer you assistance." Jacob approached the bars cautiously. "What kind of assistance?" "The kind that might keep you from hanging." She glanced down the corridor to ensure they were alone, then continued in a lower voice. "I saw what you did 3 days ago. Saw you take Elena out of that alley while everyone else stood and watched. That took courage. Took basic decency. Same thing in this town." Charlotte's mouth twisted. "I've lived in Creston Falls for 20 years. I've watched Thomas Brooks destroy 3 women that I know of. Probably more. Everyone knows what he does. Everyone looks the other way because he has money and influence and the ability to ruin anyone who crosses him. Then why are you here? Because I'm tired of being afraid. And because my daughter is 16 and I don't want her growing up in a world where men like Thomas can do whatever they want without consequence." Charlotte pulled a folded paper from her pocket. "This is a sworn statement. I witnessed Thomas and his sons assault Elena in that alley. I saw them cut her hair, strike her, mark her face, and I'll testify to it in court if necessary." Jacob took the paper through the bars, scanned it. It was exactly what she'd described, written in neat script and signed with her full name. "This could destroy you. Thomas will retaliate. Let him try. My husband owns property Thomas wants. We've refused to sell. He's been pressuring us for months, but we have lawyers, money of our own. We're not helpless like Elena." Charlotte's eyes hardened. "I should have spoken up 3 days ago. I should have done something when it was happening instead of standing there frozen. This is me trying to make that right." "Why not give this to the sheriff?" "Patterson won't use it. He's too afraid of upsetting the balance. But you can use it at trial. Make the judge hear what really happened. Make Thomas answer for it in front of the whole town." Jacob refolded the paper carefully, hope stirring for the first time since his arrest. One witness, one person willing to stand up. It might not be enough, but it was something. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Thomas has 3 days to prepare his defense. He'll bring witnesses who'll swear Elena was a terrible wife, that she deserved punishment, that you're a troublemaker who assaulted him unprovoked. It's going to get ugly." "I can handle ugly." Charlotte studied him a moment longer. "Can Elena? Because if this goes badly, if you end up in prison or worse, she's the one who'll be left facing Thomas alone. Are you sure you want to put her through that?" The question hit harder than Jacob expected. He'd been thinking tactically, how to win, how to survive, how to beat Thomas at his own game. But Charlotte was right. If he lost, Elena would be the one who paid the price. Thomas would take everything from her, and there would be nobody left to stop him. "What choice do I have?" Jacob asked. "You could plead guilty. Accept punishment. Let them fine you or put you in jail for a few months. Take the loss." Charlotte's voice was pragmatic, not unkind. Thomas gets his revenge, his pride is satisfied, and maybe he leaves Elena alone. Or maybe he sees it as permission to finish what he started. Maybe, Charlotte sighed. "There are no good options here, Mr. Hale, just different kinds of bad. I'm trying to help you see all of them before you make a choice you can't take back." Jacob looked at the paper in his hands, then back at Charlotte. "If I fight this, will you stand with me? In court? In front of everyone?" "Yes." "Even if it costs you?" "Especially if it costs me. Because that's the only way things ever change, when people decide the cost of silence is higher than the cost of speaking." Charlotte straightened. "I'll be at the trial, and I'm not the only one. There are others in town who are tired of Thomas's tyranny. We're just waiting for someone brave enough to start the fight." She left then, her footsteps echoing away, leaving Jacob with the paper and a decision to make. Fight or surrender. Risk everything or accept defeat. It wasn't really a choice. It had never been a choice. From the moment Jacob stepped into that alley and saw Elena on her knees, he'd committed himself to this path. The only question was how far he was willing to go. All the way. Whatever it took. The rest of the day passed in tense quiet. Jacob kept Charlotte's statement hidden in his boot, not trusting that Patterson wouldn't search the cell. He ate dinner mechanically, drank water, did his exercises, preparing his body and mind for what was coming. Night fell again. Jacob lay on the cot, watching moonlight creep across the cell floor, thinking about Elena. Was she safe? Had Thomas sent men to the ranch while Jacob was locked up? The not knowing was torture worse than any physical pain. Somewhere past midnight, Jacob heard it. Soft footsteps, too quiet to be the sheriff. Someone moving carefully, trying not to be heard. Jacob sat up, every sense alert. A figure appeared at the bars, small, cloaked, face hidden in shadow. For a moment, Jacob thought it might be Elena. Had she come to town? Was she here? But then the cloak fell back and he saw a young face he didn't recognize. A boy, maybe 15, with wide, frightened eyes. "Mr. Hale!" The whisper was barely audible. "Who are you?" "Name's Peter. I work at the Brooks warehouse, loading grain." The boy glanced nervously down the corridor. "I need to tell you something about Thomas's plan." Jacob moved to the bars. "What plan?" "He's not waiting for the trial. He's sending men tonight, to your ranch, to—" Peter swallowed hard. "To take care of the woman. He told his sons to make it look like an accident, like she tried to run and got thrown from her horse or something. By the time you get out, she'll be gone, and Thomas will have the land." Ice flooded Jacob's veins. "When? When did they leave?" "Hour ago, maybe less. 4 men on horseback, armed." Jacob's hands gripped the bars hard enough to hurt. Elena was alone. No protection except a locked door and a rifle she'd never fired. 4 men could break down that door in seconds, could do whatever they wanted to her, and nobody would know until it was too late. "Why are you telling me this?" Jacob asked. "Because my sister—" Peter's voice broke. "My sister worked in Thomas's house 2 years ago. Maid. He hurt her. Made her leave town. She was only 17. I couldn't stop him then, but maybe I can stop him now." Jacob's mind raced. He was locked in a cell. Patterson was probably asleep in his house on the edge of town. Even if Jacob could wake him, convince him, get him to ride out to the ranch, it would take too long. Thomas's men would be finished with whatever they planned to do long before help arrived. "Peter, I need you to do something for me. The ranch is 12 miles north, right on the creek. You know it?" "I know it." "Get a fast horse. Ride there now. Warn her. Tell her to run, to hide, anything. Can you do that?" The boy hesitated, fear and determination warring on his young face. "If Thomas finds out I helped you—" "He won't. And if he does, I'll make sure he answers for it." Jacob pulled Charlotte's statement from his boot and held it out. "Take this. If something happens to me, if I don't make it to trial, give it to Judge Morrison. Make him read it in front of the whole town. Promise me." Peter took the paper with shaking hands. "I promise." "Then go, fast as you can. And Peter?" Jacob waited until the boy met his eyes. "What you're doing takes more courage than most men show in a lifetime. Your sister would be proud." Peter nodded once, then disappeared into the shadows, his footsteps fading into silence. Jacob stood at the bars, his hands gripping the cold iron, helpless rage burning through his chest. Elena was in danger, right now, while he stood here locked away, powerless. The woman he'd promised to protect was about to face 4 armed men because Thomas Brooks couldn't stand the idea of losing. Jacob tested the bars, solid, tested the lock, no give. The window was too high and too small, even if he could reach it. The walls were stone, the floor packed earth over rock. No way out, no escape. He paced the cell like a caged animal, thoughts churning. Peter would ride hard, might reach the ranch in time to warn Elena. But even if he did, what could she do? Run into the darkness, hide in the hills? She didn't know the land, didn't know where to go, and if Thomas's men caught her in the open, away from the cabin's protection. Jacob's fist slammed into the wall. Pain shot up his arm, but he barely felt it. This was his fault. He'd made himself Elena's protector, had promised she'd be safe, and now she was about to die because he'd lost his temper and let Thomas manipulate him into a cell. Hours crawled past. Jacob couldn't sleep, couldn't rest, couldn't do anything but stand at the bars and will Peter to ride faster, Elena to be smart, the universe to show one single moment of mercy. Dawn came eventually, as it always did. Gray light filtered through the high window, revealing the same cell, the same bars, the same helplessness. Jacob's eyes were gritty from lack of sleep, his hands raw from gripping the iron. Patterson arrived with breakfast, took one look at Jacob's face and frowned. "You look like hell." "Thomas sent men to my ranch last night, 4 armed riders." Patterson's expression didn't change. "You're hearing things, making up conspiracy theories." "I'm not making it up. He's going after Elena while I'm locked in here. You need to send deputies to check on her." "I need to do no such thing." Patterson set down the tray. "You're desperate, I understand that. But inventing stories won't help your case. Listen to me." Jacob's voice rose. "If something happens to her, if Thomas's men hurt her or worse, you're complicit. You could have stopped it and you chose not to. How do you live with that?" Patterson's face was stone. "I live with it the same way I live with everything else in this job. I do what's necessary, and I sleep when I can." He turned to leave. "Patterson." Jacob's voice was quiet now, deadly. "If Elena dies, if you let that happen, there's no cell strong enough to keep me from making you answer for it. Not as law, as justice." The sheriff paused, glanced back. For a moment something flickered in his eyes, fear maybe, or recognition of the promise Jacob had just made. Then it was gone. "Trial's tomorrow, noon. Judge Morrison will hear your case and make his ruling. Until then, you stay here and keep quiet." He left. Jacob sank onto the cot, exhaustion and despair crashing over him like waves. He'd failed. He'd promised to protect Elena, and he'd failed before he'd even really started. She was alone, facing men who wanted to kill her, and there was nothing he could do but sit in this cell and wait to find out if she'd survived. The day passed in agony. Every sound made Jacob's head snap up. Was it news? Had someone come? But hour after hour brought nothing. No word from the ranch, no report of violence, just silence and uncertainty, and the slow torture of not knowing. Afternoon faded to evening. Patterson brought dinner but wouldn't meet Jacob's eyes, wouldn't answer his questions. The food sat untouched as darkness fell again, and Jacob stood at the window, staring up at stars he couldn't see, thinking about a woman he'd known for less than a week, who'd somehow become the most important thing in his world. He must have dozed eventually because he jerked awake to the sound of voices, shouting, commotion in the street outside. Jacob was at the bars instantly, straining to hear. "Found this morning. Creek, half drowned. Brooks men everywhere." The door to the jail burst open and Patterson rushed in, 2 deputies behind him. The sheriff's face was pale, his eyes wide with something that looked like shock or fear, or both. "Hale," Patterson said. "You were right." Jacob's heart stopped. "Elena, is she—" "She's alive. Barely. Doc Harris has her at his office now. Patterson was unlocking the cell, his hands fumbling with the keys. But there's more. Things you need to see. Things... He got the door open. Come on, now. Jacob didn't wait for explanation. He was out of the cell, through the corridor, into the street before Patterson could finish speaking. The town was in chaos, people gathered in clusters, talking frantically, pointing toward the doctor's office at the far end of the street. Jacob ran, his legs burning after 2 days of confinement, his lungs heaving. The doctor's office was crowded. Jacob pushed through, ignoring protests, and stopped short at the sight before him. Elena sat on an examination table, wrapped in blankets, her hair soaked, her face pale as death. But she was alive, breathing. Her eyes found Jacob's across the room, and something in them made his breath catch. Not just fear, not just relief, triumph. And standing next to her, looking equally soaked and shaken but very much alive, was Peter the boy from the warehouse. Mr. Hale. Doc Harris appeared, a gruff old man who'd been practicing medicine in Creston Falls since before the town had a name. Your friend here survived an attempt on her life last night. Would have died too if this young man hadn't warned her in time. Jacob crossed to Elena in 3 strides, his hands hovering near her shoulders, not quite touching, afraid she might shatter. Are you hurt? I'm alive. Her voice was hoarse, raw. They came. 4 men, like Peter said. Broke down the door. I ran. Made it to the creek. They followed. One of them caught me, tried to hold me under the water. Peter pulled him off, hit him with a rock. We both nearly drowned, but her laugh was broken, hysterical. But we made it. Somehow we made it. Where are they now? Thomas's men? 2 dead, Patterson said from the doorway. His voice was strange, hollow. Drowned in the creek. The other 2 ran when it went wrong, and Hale, the one Peter hit with the rock, he lived. And he's talking. Jacob turned slowly. What's he saying? Everything. Patterson's face was gray. He's confessing to attempted murder, saying Thomas Brooks hired them to kill Elena and make it look like an accident, saying there were others before her, women who disappeared or had accidents when they threatened Thomas's interests. The sheriff looked like he might be sick. He's giving names, dates, details, all of it. The room went very quiet. Elena stared at Patterson, then at Jacob, then back at the sheriff. You mean... I mean, Thomas Brooks is about to be arrested for conspiracy to commit murder, along with his sons, along with anyone else involved. Patterson's voice hardened. Judge Morrison's been informed. He's issuing warrants now. Jacob felt the world tilt, reality shifting. They'd won. Not just survived, won. Thomas's careful empire of fear and control was crumbling because one hired killer had decided saving his own neck was more important than loyalty. What happens to me? Elena asked. To my land? The land's yours never should have been in question. Patterson looked at Jacob. And you're free to go. Charges dropped. Thomas can't file complaints when he's facing murder charges himself. Jacob nodded slowly, absorbing it. Free. Elena was alive. Thomas was finished. After days of darkness and despair, the light was blinding. I need to sit down, Elena said faintly. Jacob caught her as her legs gave out, supporting her weight easily. She was shaking again, shock finally catching up now that the immediate danger had passed. He guided her back to the examination table where Doc Harris immediately began checking her vital signs. She needs rest, the doctor announced. Warm food, dry clothes, and about 3 days of sleep, but she'll recover. She can stay at my house, Charlotte Brennan's voice came from the doorway. Jacob hadn't even noticed her arrive. It's safe there, and she shouldn't be alone. Elena looked up at Jacob, question in her eyes. He nodded. Go with Charlotte. I'll handle things here. Make sure Thomas and his sons are actually locked up where they can't hurt anyone else. You'll come back? Elena's voice was small, uncertain. Soon as everything's settled, I promise. She held his gaze a moment longer, then allowed Charlotte to help her to her feet and guide her from the office. Jacob watched her go, relief and exhaustion flooding through him in equal measure. Patterson approached, his expression unreadable. I was wrong. About you. About Elena. About all of it. Yes, Jacob said flatly. You were. I thought I was protecting the town, maintaining stability. But I was just protecting a man who deserved to hang years ago. Patterson's voice was heavy with something that might have been remorse. If you want my badge, you can have it. I'll resign. I don't want your badge. I want you to do your job. Jacob turned to face him fully, which means making sure Thomas Brooks and everyone who helped him faces justice, real justice, not the kind that gets bought and sold. It'll happen. Morrison's furious. Turns out Thomas was planning to pressure him next, use threats to get favorable rulings. The judge is ready to throw the book at him. Patterson paused. And Hale? Thank you for not letting me look away, for forcing this town to see what we'd become. Jacob had no response to that. He was too tired, too wrung out to manage grace or forgiveness. He just wanted to check on his ranch, make sure his animals were fed, and sleep for about a week. He left the doctor's office and walked through the town as news spread like wildfire. Thomas Brooks arrested. Murder conspiracy. Women killed. The whispers followed him, but Jacob ignored them, heading for the livery where Red was waiting. The ride back to the ranch took forever. Jacob pushed hard, needing to see his land, confirm it was still standing. The cabin door hung broken where Thomas's men had smashed it. Inside, furniture was overturned, things scattered. Evidence of violence, of pursuit, of Elena's desperate flight. Jacob spent an hour cleaning, repairing what he could, making the space livable again. Then he walked down to the creek where it had happened. The water ran clear and cold, showing no signs of the struggle that had nearly ended 2 lives. He stood there a long time, thinking about how close it had come, how easily it could have ended differently. But it hadn't. Elena had survived. Peter had been brave, and somehow, impossibly, justice had found its way through the darkness. Jacob returned to the cabin as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and red. He built a fire, made coffee, and sat on the porch watching the land he'd claimed for himself transform in the fading light. Tomorrow he'd ride back to town, would check on Elena, make sure she was truly safe, would watch as Thomas and his sons faced the consequences they'd avoided for so long. But tonight, for a few hours at least, Jacob allowed himself to simply be. To exist without fighting, without planning, without the constant weight of someone else's survival on his shoulders. The stars came out one by one, brilliant and indifferent. The creek murmured its endless song. And somewhere in town, a woman who'd been marked for death was sleeping in a safe bed, surrounded by people who'd finally chosen to protect instead of punish. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to fair given everything Elena had endured, but it was survival. It was victory. And for now, in this moment, that was enough. 3 weeks passed before Elena returned to the ranch. 3 weeks of testimony and trials and watching Thomas Brooks's empire crumble under the weight of his own cruelty. The courtroom had been packed every day. People who'd been too afraid to speak finally finding their voices, telling stories of intimidation and violence that stretched back years. Thomas's hired man had talked for 6 hours straight, naming names, admitting to crimes that made even the judge pale. 2 murders confirmed, 3 more suspected. Women driven from town, families destroyed, all because Thomas Brooks believed his money gave him the right to crush anyone who defied him. The verdict came swift and unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Thomas and his 2 eldest sons would hang within the month. The youngest, the hothead from the alley, got 20 years hard labor for his role in the assault on Elena. Sheriff Patterson kept his badge, but everyone knew he was working on borrowed time, his authority diminished by the choices he'd made and nearly made. Through it all, Elena stayed at Charlotte Brennan's house, recovering her strength, giving her testimony with a steady voice that never wavered even when Thomas's lawyer tried to tear her apart on the stand. Jacob attended every session, sitting in the back row where Elena could see him if she needed to, his presence a reminder that she wasn't alone, wasn't defenseless anymore. Now, on a bright October morning with the air crisp and the leaves turning gold, Jacob stood on his newly repaired porch and watched Elena ride up the valley on Rosie. She sat the horse with more confidence than she'd had weeks ago, her borrowed dress replaced with new clothes Charlotte had helped her buy with money from the sale of David's land. A buyer from Colorado had honored the original offer, giving Elena enough to start fresh anywhere she wanted. She could have left. Could have taken that money and disappeared into some city where nobody knew her story, where she could be anonymous and safe. Jacob had told her as much, made it clear he expected nothing, demanded nothing, but she'd chosen to come back. Elena dismounted in front of the cabin, and Jacob saw immediately that something had changed, not just in her appearance, though her butchered hair had been trimmed into something intentional, almost stylish in its shortness, but in the way she carried herself. Shoulders back, head high, eyes that met his directly without flinching. "Place looks good," Elena said, taking in the repaired door, the fresh paint on the shutters, the general air of things being tended rather than merely endured. "It's livable." Jacob came down the steps to take Rosie's reins. "How are you?" "Tired, relieved, angry that it took so long for anyone to stop him." Elena's voice was matter of fact. "But alive. That counts for something. Counts for everything." Jacob led Rosie to the corral, giving Elena space to look around, to remember. This was the place she'd fled to in terror, where she'd hidden while men tried to kill her. It couldn't be easy coming back. But when he returned, Elena was sitting on the porch steps, her face turned toward the sun, and she looked more at peace than he'd ever seen her. "I made a decision," she said without preamble, "about what happens next." Jacob sat beside her, close but not touching, waiting. "The land from David. I'm keeping the money, but I'm not going back there. Too many bad memories. That place will never feel like mine no matter what the deed says." Elena turned to face him. "Charlotte offered me a job at the hotel. Bookkeeping, mostly. It's good work, steady pay. I could get a room in town, start building a life that's actually mine." "Sounds like a solid plan." "It is. Safe, practical, everything a sensible woman should want." Elena paused. "But I don't want it." Jacob's heart did something complicated in his chest. "What do you want?" "I want to stay here, on this ranch, with you." The words came out in a rush, like she'd been rehearsing them and needed to get them out before courage failed. Not as charity, not as someone you have to protect, as a partner. Someone who works the land, shares the responsibilities, builds something real. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, watching her face, reading the determination there mixed with fear of rejection. "Elena, you don't owe me anything. You know that, right? What I did, helping you, fighting for you, that wasn't a transaction. You don't have to repay it by staying somewhere you don't want to be." "I know that." Her voice was firm. "This isn't about debt. It's about choice. For the first time in my life, I get to choose what I want instead of just surviving whatever happens to me. And I choose this. This land, this life, this—" She gestured between them, struggling for the word. "Whatever this is between us, I choose it." "You barely know me," Jacob said, but his voice was gentle, not dismissive. 3 weeks of crisis doesn't tell you who a person really is. I'm not easy to live with. I'm quiet. I keep to myself. I've got habits you'll find irritating and memories that wake me up at night. This ranch is isolated. Nearest town is 2 hours. Nearest neighbor even further. Winters are hard, summers are brutal, and the work never stops. You deserve better than that." "Better according to who?" Elena's eyes flashed. "I spent a year being told what I deserved, what I should want, what my life should look like. David was a good man, but I married him because I was 17 and scared, and he was the best option available. Then he died, and I spent every day since being punished for not grieving correctly, not behaving correctly, not being the perfect grateful widow. I'm done living by other people's definitions of what my life should be." Jacob felt something shift inside him, something that had been locked away since Margaret died, starting to cautiously open. What if it doesn't work? What if we drive each other crazy or discover we can't stand each other? Or then I leave. I take my money and I go, and we both move on with our lives. Elena's voice softened. "But Jacob, what if it does work? What if this, whatever we're building, turns into something real and lasting? Don't I deserve the chance to find out?" "You deserve everything," Jacob said quietly. "That's what worries me. I'm just a man with a ranch and a rifle and no idea how to be what you need." Elena reached out then, her hand covering his on the porch step. Her touch was warm, solid, real. I don't need you to be anything except honest about who you are, what you want, what you can and can't give. I've had enough of men who make promises they don't keep. If you don't want me here, tell me now and I'll go with no hard feelings. But if there's any part of you that thinks this might work, that we might actually build something good together, then say so. Jacob looked at her hand on his, then at her face, scarred from violence but somehow stronger for it, alive with possibility instead of crushed by trauma. He thought about the weeks alone in his cabin after Margaret died, the years of going through motions without purpose. He thought about stepping into that alley, about the moment he decided one woman's dignity was worth fighting for. And he thought about the future, about what it might look like with someone beside him who chose to be there not from necessity, but from want. I wake up at dawn, Jacob said finally. Every day, no exceptions. I drink my coffee black and I burn everything I cook that isn't meat or beans. I don't talk much, especially in the mornings, and I need time alone to think or I get mean. The ranch needs constant work, fences, roofing, animals, planting if we're going to grow anything. Money's tight until we can build the herd up. And He stopped, swallowed. I still love my wife, Margaret. Part of me always will. That's not going to change. I don't want it to change, Elena said. She was part of your life, part of who you are. I'm not trying to replace her or erase her. I'm just asking for space to be someone different, someone new in your life. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is. Jacob turned his hand over, letting his fingers close around hers. The touch sent electricity up his arm, awareness he hadn't felt in years. I can't promise you romance or poetry or any of that. I can promise you honesty, hard work, and that I'll never lie to you or hurt you deliberately. I can promise that this ranch will be as much yours as mine, that your voice matters as much as mine in every decision. And I can promise that if you choose to stay, I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of that choice. Elena's smile was slow, genuine, reaching all the way to her eyes. That's more than I've ever been promised before. I'll take it. They sat there on the porch steps as the sun climbed higher, hands joined, both of them aware they were standing on the edge of something that could either be wonderful or disastrous, and choosing to step forward anyway. So what happens now? Elena asked eventually. Now we work. Jacob stood, pulling her up with him. I'll show you the ranch. Teach you what needs doing. You tell me if you can see yourself here long term, or if it's too much. We take it day by day, see how it goes. Day by day, Elena agreed. I can do that. The next weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised them both with its ease. Jacob taught Elena to ride properly, to mend fences, to read the sky for weather. She learned where the best grazing was, which water sources stayed full year-round, how to tell when a horse needed attention. In return, she brought organization to the chaos of ranch life, set up a proper system for supplies, started a garden that would produce vegetables come spring, cooked meals that didn't taste like leather. They learned each other's patterns. Jacob's need for early morning silence. Elena's tendency to talk through problems out loud. The way Jacob's hands never stopped moving, always repairing or building something. The way Elena would stand at the window at dusk, watching the light change, her face peaceful in a way it never was in town. They learned to work together too. Herding cattle required coordination. Jacob on Red, Elena on Rosie, moving as a unit. Repairing the barn roof needed 4 hands and careful communication. Even simple things like cooking dinner became a joint effort, Jacob handling the meat while Elena managed everything else. And slowly, carefully, they learned to be comfortable with each other in ways that had nothing to do with work. Sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching stars emerge. Sharing coffee in the morning without needing to fill the silence with words. Small touches, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing as they pass tools back and forth, that spoke of growing ease rather than obligation. 6 weeks after Elena returned to the ranch, the first snow came. Not the brutal storms that would arrive later, but soft, fat flakes that turned the world white and quiet. Jacob woke to find Elena already up, standing on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the snow fall. Beautiful, she said when he joined her. It's going to make everything harder, feeding the animals, keeping the water from freezing, getting to town if we need supplies. I know. Elena glanced at him. Still beautiful, though. Jacob smiled despite himself. That was Elena, able to see both the practical difficulties and the wonder of things. It was one of the many things he'd come to value about her presence. They spent the day preparing for winter, moving extra hay into the barn, checking the woodpile, making sure the cabin was sealed against drafts. Hard physical work that left them both exhausted. That night, Elena cooked venison stew that actually tasted like something worth eating, and they sat at the table while the fire crackled and the snow continued falling outside. Tell me about her, Elena said suddenly. Margaret, what was she like? Jacob's first instinct was to deflect, to change the subject, but Elena's face held only genuine curiosity, no jealousy or insecurity. She wanted to know, wanted to understand the woman who'd come before her. She was brave, Jacob said finally. Braver than me in most ways. When I wanted to stay in Missouri after the war, she's the one who pushed to come west, said there was nothing left for us in a place that had been torn apart by violence. She wanted to build something new. He paused, memory washing over him. She was practical, didn't complain about hardships, just figured out how to deal with them. And she laughed, not polite laughter, but the kind that came from her belly and made everyone around her smile. You must have loved her very much. I did. Still do, in the way you love someone who shaped who you are. Jacob met Elena's eyes. But she's gone. Been gone 6 years. And at some point, loving someone who's dead becomes just another way of hiding from living. Elena was quiet, absorbing that. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. I'm glad you told me. She sounds like she was worth loving. She was. Jacob squeezed her hand gently. And Elena, you are too. The words hung in the air between them, simple and true. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, and Jacob realized he'd just crossed some invisible line, had admitted what they'd both been dancing around for weeks. This wasn't just practicality, wasn't just partnership or shared work or mutual survival. This was the beginning of something that might actually be called love. Winter deepened. The snow kept coming, piling up in drifts that made travel difficult and isolation complete. But the cabin was warm, the cellar was stocked, and the animals weathered the cold with careful tending. Jacob and Elena fell into patterns that felt like they'd existed forever. Morning coffee, daily chores, evenings by the fire where they read or talked or simply sat in comfortable silence. Christmas came and went, marked by a simple exchange of gifts. Jacob gave Elena a silver comb he'd bought months ago, back when she first arrived with her hair hacked short. She'd cried when she opened it, running her fingers over the delicate metalwork. For when it grows back, Jacob said quietly, to replace what was taken. Elena gave him a new saddle blanket she'd woven herself during long evenings, the pattern intricate and beautiful. For Red, she said, so you remember you're not riding alone anymore. They didn't speak of what the gifts meant beyond their practical use. They didn't need to. The meaning was clear in the careful thought behind each present, in the way small gestures carried weight that words couldn't match. January brought the worst storms, days when they couldn't leave the cabin, when wind howled and snow piled so high it blocked the door. They kept busy with indoor tasks, but the forced proximity also brought conversations they'd been avoiding. Do you regret it? Elena asked one evening while mending a shirt. Taking me from that alley? Everything that came after? Jacob considered the question seriously. The arrest, the trial, the near death of both Elena and young Peter. The way his quiet, isolated life had been shattered and rebuilt into something unrecognizable. No, he said finally. I regret that it took so long for Thomas to face justice. I regret that you had to suffer so much before anyone helped. But taking you out of that alley, bringing you here, standing against men who deserve to be stood against, no, I don't regret any of that. Even though it cost you your peace? Peace built on looking away from injustice isn't worth keeping. Jacob set down the harness he was oiling. You asked me once why I helped you. The truth is, I helped you because I needed to remember I was still human, still capable of caring about something other than my own survival. You gave me that back. Elena's hand stilled on the mending. I think we saved each other then. You saved me from Thomas, and I saved you from becoming someone you didn't want to be. Maybe we did. February arrived with the first signs of thaw, days when the sun felt warm despite the cold, when icicles dripped and snow began retreating. Jacob and Elena ventured out more, checking fence lines, looking for early calves, planning for spring planting. One afternoon, Jacob found Elena standing by the creek where she'd nearly died. She stood very still, staring at the water that ran clear and cold over smooth stones. "You all right?" Jacob approached carefully. "I was thinking about that night, about how close it came to ending differently." Elena's voice was steady but thoughtful. "That man, the one Peter hit with the rock, he had my head under water. I couldn't breathe, couldn't fight, couldn't do anything but know I was about to die. And I remember thinking how unfair it was, that I'd finally started to believe I could have a real life, and it was being taken away before I got to live it." Jacob stood beside her, silent, letting her work through whatever she needed to say. "But I didn't die," Elena continued. "Peter saved me, and then you saved both of us by getting Thomas arrested. And now I'm standing here, alive, free, with choices I never thought I'd have. And I'm trying to figure out what to do with that, with this second chance I didn't earn and don't deserve, but somehow got anyway." "You deserved it," Jacob said firmly. "You deserve every good thing this life can give you." Elena turned to face him. "Then I want this. I want to stay here, build a life on this land, be part of what you're creating, not as a guest or someone passing through, as someone who belongs." Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd been feeling the same thing for weeks, but had been afraid to name it, afraid to assume Elena wanted more than temporary shelter and protection. But here she was, offering herself not from desperation, but from genuine desire to build something together. "I want that too," Jacob said quietly. "Want you here. Want us to be—" He struggled for the right word. Partners wasn't enough. Friends didn't capture it. "Want us to be whatever we choose to be. Together." Elena stepped closer, closing the small distance between them. "Jacob Hale, I'm choosing you. I'm choosing this life, this land, this future we could build. I'm choosing all of it with clear eyes and a willing heart. Will you choose me back?" Jacob reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his rough, work-worn hands. Her skin was soft against his calluses, warm despite the cold air. "I choose you, Elena Brooks. I choose your strength, your courage, your stubborn refusal to stay broken. I choose every hard day and every good one if it means facing them with you beside me." He kissed her then, soft and careful, a promise rather than a demand. Elena melted into it, her hands finding his shoulders, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had spent too long trying to destroy her. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Elena was crying. But she was also smiling, wider and more genuine than Jacob had ever seen. "We should probably get married," Elena said, half laughing through tears. "If we're going to do this properly, though I have no idea how that works. Do we ride to town, find a preacher? Do I need a different dress?" "We could do all that," Jacob agreed. "Or we could do it simpler, just us, this land, and promises made to each other that don't need a church or witnesses to make them real." Elena considered that, her fingers still tangled in his shirt. "I like that better. I've had one wedding with crowds and expectations and family politics. This time I want it to be just about us." "Then that's what we'll do." They chose the next Sunday, more for the symbolism of a fresh start than any religious reason. Jacob cleaned up as best he could, putting on his only good shirt. Elena wore the blue calico dress, Margaret's dress that had become hers, and wove wildflowers into her short hair. They stood by the creek in the late afternoon sun, the water running between them and the valley spreading out in all directions. No preacher, no Bible, no crowd, just two people who'd found each other in violence and chaos and somehow made something good from it. "I promise to be honest with you," Jacob said, holding both her hands in his, "to never lie, never manipulate, never make you question your own worth. I promise to work beside you, not over you, to respect your choices even when I disagree, to be the kind of partner who lifts you up instead of holding you down." Elena's voice was steady despite her tears. "I promise to trust you, even when fear tells me not to speak my mind instead of making myself small, to work with you to build something that's ours, not just yours or mine. And I promise that every day I choose to stay is a real choice, made freely, because I want to be here with you. There were no rings. They discussed it and decided the money was better spent on spring supplies. There was no official pronouncement, no legal document, just two people making promises to each other under an open sky, witnessed by the land itself and nothing else. And it was enough. More than enough. They kissed as the sun touched the horizon, sealing promises that had been built on shared hardship and mutual respect rather than romance or desperation. When they pulled apart, Elena was laughing again, that deep, genuine laughter that came from joy rather than humor. "What?" Jacob asked, smiling despite himself. "I was just thinking, 6 months ago I was on my knees in an alley having my life destroyed. And now I'm standing here, married to a man I actually chose, on land that feels like home. How did that happen?" "You refused to stay broken," Jacob said. "And I refused to let you be destroyed. Everything else just followed from there." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, taking their time, savoring the last light of day. That night they ate simple food, sat by the fire, and talked about plans for spring, where to plant, what crops to try, how many calves they expected. Practical conversations about a shared future that felt more romantic than any poetry. Later, Elena fell asleep in the bed that had been Jacob's alone for so long, her breathing soft and even. Jacob lay awake beside her, still amazed that this was real, that she'd chosen to stay, that somehow two broken people had found a way to be whole together. He thought about Margaret, about the life they'd planned that never came to be. He thought about the years alone, convinced he'd never want or need anyone again. And he thought about the moment in that alley when he'd seen a woman being destroyed and decided it wasn't acceptable. One choice. One moment of refusing to look away. And it had led to this. A second chance at life, at partnership, at building something worth having. Outside, the creek sang its endless song. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. And inside the cabin, two people slept in peace, their hands still joined beneath the quilts, already dreaming of the spring to come. The seasons turned as they always did. Spring brought new calves, successful planting, and Elena's laughter ringing across the valley as she learned to rope cattle and cursed creatively when they got away. Summer brought hard work from dawn to dusk, both of them bronzed by sun and strengthened by constant labor. Fall brought harvest and preparation for another winter. The cellar stocked fuller this time. The cabin made warmer with extra insulation. Through it all, they learned each other deeper. Jacob discovered Elena had a gift for numbers and organization, turning his scattered ranch management into something efficient. Elena discovered Jacob had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed, making her laugh with observations so subtle she almost missed them. They had fights, too. Inevitable when two strong-willed people shared small spaces and hard work. But they learned to fight fair, to speak their minds without cruelty, to forgive without keeping score. They learned that anger could coexist with love, that disagreement didn't mean disaster. And they learned that choosing each other once wasn't enough. You had to keep choosing, every day, through good times and hard ones. A year after their creekside wedding, Elena stood on the porch at sunset, one hand resting on her slightly rounded belly, watching Jacob fix a gate in the distance. She felt the baby move. Their baby. Unexpected but welcome, and smiled at the perfect rightness of it. She'd survived being marked, survived being hunted, survived nearly drowning. She'd stood up to men who wanted to destroy her, found her voice when silence seemed safer, chose life when death would have been easier. And she'd ended up here, on this land, with this man, carrying a child who would grow up knowing that strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up, over and over, until you finally found solid ground. Jacob noticed her watching and waved, his face splitting into that rare, full smile that still took her breath away. She waved back, feeling tears prick her eyes the way they often did these days. Pregnancy hormones, she told herself. But really, it was just overwhelming gratitude for a life she never thought she'd get to live. The sun sank below the mountains, painting the sky in impossible colors. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more of the endless labor that was ranch life. But tonight, there was this: peace, contentment, and the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Elena placed her hand over Jacob's child growing inside her and whispered a promise to that future person. You will never have to earn your worth. You will never have to make yourself small. You will be loved not for what you can provide, but simply for existing. It was the same promise Jacob had made to her, lived out in 1,000 small moments of respect and partnership. And it was the promise they would both keep to this child, to any children who came after, to the life they were building together on land that had witnessed their transformation. From broken to whole, from alone to together, from surviving to living. The marked woman who'd been on her knees in that alley was gone, replaced by someone who stood tall and unafraid. The solitary man who'd hidden from life had become a husband, and soon a father, connected and present in ways he'd thought he'd lost forever. They'd saved each other, and in doing so, they'd saved themselves. As darkness fell and stars emerged one by one, Elena went inside to where Jacob was building a cradle with careful, patient hands. She watched him work, this man who'd stepped into an alley and changed everything, and felt her heart swell with a love that had nothing to do with rescue or debt. This was partnership, this was choice, this was home, and it was more than enough. It was everything.